Imagine for a moment that your greatest source of power, your wildest creativity, and your most authentic vitality are not in the light you seek, but precisely in the darkness you avoid. Imagine that the evil you were taught to fear and repress is not an enemy to be destroyed, but a locked vault that holds the most precious jewels of your soul. Carl Jung did not just flirt with this idea. He revealed it as the central architecture of the human psyche. He taught us that within our dark side, the shadow resides not only the monster, but also the unlived hero, the silenced artist, the passionate lover who was judged as inadequate. Your depression, your anxiety, your compulsions, what if they are not illnesses, but the desperate cry of valuable parts of you that were exiled and now violently knock on the door of your consciousness, begging to be seen? What you call your personal demon may, in fact, be your guardian angel in disguise, trying to save you from a mediocre, safe, and incomplete life. If these words echo in some silent place within you, if they touch the wound of your own incompleteness, then understand that you did not arrive at this video by chance. You arrived by a calling. The path to truth is steep and often lonely. Therefore, this channel is not a mere repository of information. It is a bonfire in the middle of the darkness, a meeting point for those who have had the courage to stop running from themselves. If you are ready to begin the most important journey of your life, do this now. Subscribe, not to increase in number, but to declare to yourself that you refuse to live with only half of your soul. Give your like, not for an algorithm, but as a signal to the universe that you are ready to face your own light and your own shadow. And leave a comment with the phrase, "I begin the journey, not for us, but as the first act of courage in your journal of transformation." From here on, we do not promise comfort, but we promise truth. The greatest and most dangerous lie we tell ourselves is that evil is an external phenomenon, a plague that exists out there, in the other, in the enemy, in the system. This is the grand illusion of the ego, a defense mechanism that allows us to maintain an image of purity and moral righteousness, while secretly projecting our own darkness onto the world. Since the beginning of time, humanity has sought scapegoats to carry the weight of its own unacknowledged sins. We see this in witch hunts, in political persecutions, in religious conflicts, and more subtly, in our own homes and relationships. When we point a finger in fury at the greed of the businessman, the arrogance of the politician, or the betrayal of a friend, we rarely ask ourselves, where does this same seed of greed, arrogance, or betrayal exist within me, even in an embryonic or repressed form? Jung called this mechanism the projection of the shadow. It is an unconscious act in which we offload the qualities we cannot accept in ourselves onto the screen of the external world. The world, then, becomes a perfect reflection of our unexamined inner hell. The problem with this dynamic is that, by fighting the evil out there, we are actually fighting windmills, a futile war against our own mirrored image. We expend immense psychic energy on moral crusades that do not solve the root cause of the conflict, which always resides in the individual psyche. True moral courage is not in condemning the monster in the other, but in having the humility to recognize the same monster crouching in our own basement. This recognition is terrifying, as it shatters our self-image as a good person. However, it is the only path to psychological maturity. As long as we refuse to look at our own capacity for evil, we will remain infantilized, trapped in a dualistic worldview of good guys and bad guys. Integration begins when we withdraw our projections, when we dare to look into the abyss of our own nature and admit, this, too, is me. It is an act of radical honesty that frees us from the need to hate the world, and gives us the power to finally begin transforming it from the only place where real change is possible, within ourselves. The journey to wholeness requires that we become detectives of our own soul, investigating every exaggerated emotional reaction to something external as a clue to a treasure or a monster hidden internally. The shadow is the archetype of our other self, the twin who was born with us the moment consciousness ignited, but who was relegated to live in the dark. It is not a creation of our personal biography, although it is deeply colored by it. At its root, the shadow is an archetypal structure, an inherent and unavoidable part of the human psyche. It is the repository of everything that the ego, in its effort to adapt to the external world, has deemed unacceptable, inferior, immoral, or simply inconvenient. From childhood, we are subjected to a process of psychic pruning. Our parents, teachers, and culture tell us what is good and what is bad. To be loved and accepted, we learn to repress the bad traits, our aggression, our selfishness, our raw sexuality, our laziness, our envy. Each of these aspects does not disappear. It is simply pushed into the basement of the unconscious, where it joins other exiles to form the shadow. The content of the shadow, however, is not universally negative. In it, we also find positive qualities that have been repressed. A man raised in an environment that values logic and strength may repress his sensitivity, his intuition, and his capacity for nurturing, casting them into the shadow for being feminine or weak. A woman educated to be docile and pleasing may exile her assertiveness, her ambition, and her righteous anger. Therefore, the shadow is a paradoxical terrain, where our most destructive potential lives side by side with our most vibrant creativity and our most authentic power. It is the home of what Jung called the gold and the darkness. The problem is that the ego tends to see all the content of the shadow as a threat. It spends a tremendous amount of energy keeping the door to this basement locked, through denial, repression, and projection. But the shadow is alive and dynamic. The psychic energy contained within it cannot be destroyed. It seeks expression. When it is not consciously acknowledged and integrated, it erupts in uncontrolled ways, in slips of the tongue, in disproportionate emotional outbursts, in disturbing dreams, in psychosomatic symptoms, and most dangerously, in acts of self-sabotage. The encounter with the shadow is, therefore, the moral task par excellence. It requires that we stop identifying only with our persona, the social mask we wear, and dare to venture into the unknown territory of ourselves. It is a process of expanding consciousness, where we learn to say I am both, the kind person and the angry being, the diligent worker and the lazy dreamer, the saint and the sinner. It is in this acceptance of our wholeness, with all its contradictions, that true strength resides. Projection is the main mechanism by which the shadow manifests in the world. Without our being aware of it, it is an automatic and unconscious psychological process through which we attribute our own unacceptable qualities, impulses, and feelings to other people, groups, or situations. Instead of admitting I feel envy, the psyche projects and experiences the feeling as that person is envious of me. Instead of confronting one's own aggressiveness, we see the world as a dangerous place full of hostile people. Projection works like a cinema projector. The film our shadow content is inside us, but the image is seen on the screen of the external world. This mechanism has a defensive function. It protects the ego from the pain of having to recognize aspects of itself that it considers shameful or threatening. It is much easier and more morally comfortable to hate an external enemy than to confront the enemy within. The intensity of our emotional reaction to another person is the surest clue that a projection is underway. That which irritates, fascinates, or disgusts us disproportionately in others is almost always a hook on which we hang an unrecognized part of ourselves. The moral fanatic who sees sin everywhere is, in fact, fighting desperately against his own repressed impulses. The individual who incessantly criticizes is the laziness of others, may be projecting his own unlived laziness or, conversely, a part of himself that yearns for rest but is tyrannized by a merciless superego. Projections are not only negative, we can also project our golden shadow, our undeveloped positive qualities. This happens when we excessively idolize someone, a mentor, an artist, a romantic passion. We attribute to that person qualities of genius, strength, or beauty that, in fact, belong to our own unrealized potential. Projection, in itself, is not pathological. It is a natural function of the psyche. The danger lies in remaining unconscious of it. When we live in a state of constant projection, we lose touch with reality. Our relationships become battlegrounds for unconscious dramas, where we never see the other as they truly are, but only as a screen for our own content. On a collective level, the projection of the shadow is the root of xenophobia, racism, war, and genocide. It allows one group to define itself as good and project all of its darkness onto another group, the enemy, which can then be dehumanized and destroyed without guilt. The cure for the plague of projection is a painful process called the withdrawal of projections. It requires rigorous introspection and the courage to ask, that which I so hate, admire in the other, in what way does it also belong to me? Each withdrawn projection is a piece of the soul that comes home. It is an act that makes us more responsible, more humble, and, paradoxically, more capable of genuine love and compassion. For we can only truly connect with others when we stop using them as coat racks for our own. Shadows. It is crucial to understand that the shadow is not a mere personal flaw, an accumulation of misconceptions from a single life. It is, in its essence, an archetype. This means that it belongs to the fundamental structure of the human psyche, a heritage of the collective unconscious that we all carry. Just as we carry the archetype of the mother, the hero, or the wise old man, it is the universal representation of the other side, of what is primitive, instinctive, and socially unacceptable. The shadow was not created by you. It was born with human consciousness itself, as its inevitable counterpart. To deny it is, therefore, to deny a fundamental part of your own humanity, a futile attempt to dissociate yourself from the matrix from which we all emerge. Within this archetypal basement of the soul, we find not only our vilest and most destructive impulses, such as anger, envy, greed, and cruelty. We also find a vast range of positive and neutral qualities that have been repressed for being inconvenient to our conscious ego or to the culture in which we live. There reside wild creativity, childlike spontaneity, assertiveness that was judged as aggression, sensuality that was branded as immoral. The shadow is the home of everything that is instinctive, chaotic, and undifferentiated. A force of nature that pulses within us. It is our connection to the ancestral animal, to the earth, to life in its rawest and therefore most vital form. The function of the shadow is to serve as a constant counterbalance to our persona, the social mask we present to the world. While the persona strives for perfection, acceptance, and control, the shadow reminds us of our incompleteness, our fallibility, and our complexity. The tension between these two forces is what generates the psychic energy necessary for growth. Without the shadow, the persona becomes a fragile, rigid, and lifeless facade. Without the persona, the shadow would swallow us in a chaos of primal impulses. The path to wholeness is not the elimination of one in favor of the other, but the painful and courageous recognition that both are faces of the same being. The archetypal nature of the shadow also explains why it is so powerful and frightening. When we encounter it in our dreams or in projections, it often takes on mythological forms, demons, monsters, dragons. These images represent the transpersonal and primordial energy contained in the archetype. It is greater than our small ego. That is why the confrontation with the shadow is often described as a dark night of the soul, or a descent into the underworld Nakia. It is an experience that shakes the foundations of our identity. However, it is precisely in this confrontation with the archetypal power of the shadow that the potential for profound transformation lies. By facing the dragon, the hero of mythology not only survives, but also gains access to the treasure the dragon was guarding. Similarly, by confronting our shadow, we not only become more aware of our capacity for evil, but also release the vital and creative energy that was imprisoned with it. The continuous repression of the shadow is the most dangerous attitude an individual can take towards their own psyche. Psychic energy, like physical energy, cannot be destroyed, it only transforms. When the contents of the shadow are consistently denied and pushed into the unconscious, they do not disappear. Instead, they begin to agglutinate around an archetypal core, forming what Jung called an autonomous complex. A complex is like a partial personality, a splitter of the psyche that begins to live a life of its own, outside the control of the conscious ego. The shadow complex, in particular, is the most dangerous of all. When the shadow becomes autonomous, it behaves like an internal saboteur. It interferes with our conscious intentions, leads us to commit acts we later bitterly regret. I don't know what came over me, and traps us in destructive patterns of behavior, such as addictions, compulsions, and toxic relationships. The person possessed by an autonomous shadow complex often feels like a victim of circumstances, unable to understand why their life is always going wrong. without realizing that it is their own hidden hand orchestrating the disaster. A clear sign that a shadow complex is active is possession. During a possession, the ego is temporarily overthrown and the complex takes control of the personality. This is visible in uncontrollable fits of rage, in episodes of shocking cruelty in a normally gentle person, or in impulsive and catastrophic life decisions. After the episode, when the ego resumes control, the person may feel deep shame and confusion, as if they had been inhabited by a strange force. This strange force is, simply, their own neglected shadow, which, starved for attention, has broken down the door of consciousness. The more moral and correct a person tries to be, repressing all bad impulses, the darker and more powerful their shadow becomes, and the greater the risk of a possession. It is the paradox of Puritanism. The attempt to eradicate evil only strengthens it in the unconscious. The story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is the perfect literary illustration of this process. The respectable Dr. Jekyll, in trying to chemically repress his dark side, ends up creating a monstrous alter ego, Mr. Hyde, who eventually destroys him. The lesson is clear. Denial does not eliminate the shadow. It makes it monstrous. The only antidote to possession by the shadow complex is conscious integration. This does not mean acting out the dark impulses, but rather bringing them into the light of consciousness, recognizing them as part of oneself, understanding their origins and their needs, and finding constructive ways to express their energy. It is a process that transforms the internal saboteur into a valuable ally. Ignoring the shadow is like ignoring a gas leak in your house. Sooner or later, a spark will cause an explosion. The work of integrating the shadow is not just a matter of individual psychological well-being. It is, according to Jung, a moral imperative and the most crucial and urgent task facing humanity. The great catastrophe of the 20th century, with its world wars, its concentration camps, and its atomic bombs, was not the result of a failure in politics or economics, but rather a massive-scale psychological failure. It was the direct consequence of millions of individuals projecting their unrecognized shadow onto an external enemy. When modern man lost his myths and rituals that helped him deal with the power of the unconscious, he became dangerously unaware of his own darkness. This darkness then accumulated in the collective unconscious and erupted in the form of totalitarian ideologies and mass violence. Jung stated that there is no darkness so dense that it can extinguish the brightness of a single candle. However, he also warned us that if each individual does not light their own small candle of consciousness to illuminate their inner darkness, the collective darkness will swallow us all. Psychology shows us that the evil we see in the world is a mirror of the evil that exists within each human psyche. There is no clear line separating good people from bad people. The line, as Solzhenitsyn wrote, cuts through the heart of every human being. Each of us carries within us the potential to be both a saint and a torturer. The only difference is the degree of self-knowledge. The one who is conscious of their own shadow, of their own capacity for cruelty, for lying, and for hatred, becomes humble. This humility is the greatest antidote to the moral inflation that leads to fanatical certainty and violence. The person who knows their shadow thinks twice before condemning others, because they know that, under the right circumstances, they could have done the same. On the other hand, the individual who believes themselves to be purely good and projects their shadow onto others is the most dangerous of all. They become an unconscious agent of evil, convinced of their own righteousness while committing atrocities in the name of good. Therefore, the act of looking at one's own shadow, however painful and humiliating it may be, is the most radical political act we can perform. It is an act that withdraws energy from the cycle of projection and hatred that fuels the world's conflicts. Every time an individual withdraws a projection and takes responsibility for their own darkness, they heal not only themselves but also a small part of the world. World peace will not be achieved through treaties or agreements, but when a sufficient number of individuals have the courage to make peace with their own inner enemy. This is the task that falls to us. It is the responsibility that consciousness imposes on us. We can no longer afford to be psychologically naive. The future of our species depends on our ability to become conscious of the shadow. The integration of the shadow is not an intellectual exercise, but an experiential, often painful and visceral journey. One cannot simply decide to integrate the shadow. One must encounter it, dialogue with it, and, finally, learn to live with it. This process requires courage, honesty, and often the support of an experienced guide, such as an analytical therapist. The first step is recognition. This begins with the careful observation of oneself. Pay attention to your disproportionate emotional reactions, both positive and negative. The person who deeply irritates you at work, the politician you hate with a passion, the celebrity you despise, they are all carriers of your projected shadow. Instead of focusing on their flaws, ask yourself, what part of me is being activated here? Where does this same quality exist in me, even if I don't like to admit it? Likewise, pay attention to who you admire excessively. The quality you project as genius or courage in the other is a reflection of your own golden, unlived potential. The second step is dream work. Dreams are the language of the unconscious, the royal road to the shadow, as Freud would say. In dreams, the shadow often appears as a figure of the same sex as the dreamer, often with threatening or despicable characteristics. The pursuer in the nightmare, the vagrant, the criminal, these are personifications of your shadow. Instead of running from these figures, the task is to turn and confront them. Ask them what they want. Dialoguing with dream figures, whether through writing, art, or active imagination, a Jungian meditation technique, is a powerful way to initiate communication with the repressed parts of yourself. The third step is brutal honesty with yourself. This involves abandoning the need to be good and accepting your complexity. It means admitting your pettiest thoughts, your feelings of envy, your desires for revenge. Not to act on them, but to acknowledge their existence. Keeping an uncensored journal, where you allow your shadow to speak freely, can be a transformative practice. It is a safe space to contain and examine the impulses that cannot be released into the external world. Finally, integration involves finding constructive expressions for the shadow's energy. Repressed aggressiveness can be channeled into competitive sports, into advocating for a just cause, or into assertiveness in business. Repressed sexual energy can be expressed through dance, art, or a deeper, more conscious intimacy. The goal is not to unleash the monster, but to tame it and put its immense strength and vitality at the service of life and consciousness. This process is never complete. The integration of the shadow is a lifelong work. Each new stage of life, each crisis, will bring up new layers of the shadow to be confronted. It is a spiral, not a straight line, but each turn on the spiral makes us more whole, more humble, and more human. The biggest misconception about the shadow is to see it only as a repository of negativity. Although it certainly contains our most destructive traits, it is also the source of immense psychic richness. Jung used the metaphor of alchemy to describe the process of individuation, referring to the shadow as the prima materia, the raw, dark, and chaotic material from which the philosophical gold of consciousness can be created. When we avoid the shadow, we are not just avoiding our pain and our capacity for evil. We are also disconnecting from our vitality, our spontaneity, and our deepest creativity. The shadow contains everything that is instinctive, earthy, and embodied. It is our connection to the animal within, to the wisdom of the body, and to the primordial energies of life. A person who lives only from their persona, excessively controlled and adapted, often feels dry, lifeless, depressed. They may be functional and successful, but they lack juice, passion. This lost vitality is imprisoned in the shadow. By reconnecting with the shadow, we reclaim this energy. Repressed anger, for example, when consciously integrated, transforms into assertiveness and the ability to set healthy boundaries. Fear, when confronted, becomes a source of prudence and respect. Sadness, when allowed, opens the heart to compassion. Creativity, in particular, is intrinsically linked to the shadow. The great artists, poets, and innovators are almost always individuals who have had the courage to dive into the depths of their own unconscious and wrestle with their inner demons. Creativity requires access to the chaos, the irrational, the raw material of the psyche that normal consciousness considers dangerous or meaningless. The shadow is the untamed muse, trying to be creative only from the conscious. Rational mind is like trying to paint a picture using only the color white. The vibrant colors, the rich textures, and the dramatic contrasts come from the palette of the shadow. Rescuing the gold and the darkness also gives us access to a different kind of power. Not the power to dominate others, which is a characteristic of the inflated shadow, but the power of authenticity. A person who has integrated parts of their shadow becomes more real, more three-dimensional. They lose the fragility of the person who must constantly maintain a facade of perfection. They can admit their mistakes, laugh at their own flaws, and relate to others from a place of genuine humanity rather than moral superiority. This authenticity is magnetically attractive and profoundly liberating. The journey into the shadow is, therefore, a treasure hunt. It is frightening because, to get to the gold, we have to go past the dragon that guards it. But the treasure is real. It is the treasure of our own unlived life, waiting to be claimed. By embracing our darkness, we do not become evil, we become whole. And in our wholeness, we find the true light. Just as every individual possesses a personal shadow, composed of their repressed traits, every group, nation, and culture possesses a collective shadow. The collective shadow is the dark side of the group's identity, containing all the qualities, historical memories, and impulses that the group refuses to acknowledge about itself. A nation that prides itself on its freedom may have a shadow of imperialism and slavery. A culture that values rationality and science may have a shadow of irrationality and superstition. That erupts in cults and conspiracy theories. The collective shadow is the unspoken of history. The skeletons in the national closet, like the personal shadow. The collective shadow is most dangerous when it is unconscious and projected. The mechanism is exactly the same, but amplified on a terrifying scale. The group projects its shadow onto a rival nation, an ethnic minority, or an ideological group. This other group becomes the carrier of all evil, all inferiority, and all threat. While the projecting group feels united in its virtuous and just identity, this is the fertile, psychological ground for war, terrorism, and genocide. The Holocaust was not an event that came out of nowhere. It was the eruption of the European collective shadow, which for centuries had projected onto the Jewish people dark archetypes, such as the usurer, the conspirator, and the Christ killer. When economic and political conditions became unstable, this projected shadow became the justification for exterminatory violence. Charismatic leaders and demagogues are experts at manipulating the collective shadow. They point to a scapegoat and give the people permission to hate it, thereby releasing repressed dark energies in a way that seems justified and even heroic. The person who participates in a lynching or an act of mass violence often loses their sense of individual identity and is absorbed by the psyche of the crowd, possessed by the collective shadow. In this state, they are capable of committing acts of cruelty that would be unthinkable for them as an individual. The confrontation with the collective shadow is even more difficult than the confrontation with the personal shadow. It requires a nation to look at the most shameful chapters of its history, to acknowledge its past and present injustices, and to take responsibility for them. Processes like truth and reconciliation commissions, formal apologies for historical atrocities, and honest education about a country's past are attempts, often imperfect, to integrate the collective shadow. Without this conscious work, the collective shadow does not disappear. It is passed down from generation to generation, poisoning the present with the unresolved sins of the past. The only hope for a more peaceful future lies in the courage of each culture to do its own soul-searching, to withdraw its projections, and to recognize that the line between us and them, between good and evil, is perilously thin. The final goal of the psychological process described by Jung is not perfection, but wholeness. Perfection is an ideal of the ego, a fantasy of becoming purely good, purely luminous, without flaws or contradictions. Wholeness, on the other hand, is an ideal of the self, the organizing center of the psyche which seeks the union of opposites. Wholeness does not eliminate the shadow, it integrates it into a broader, more conscious personality. It is the recognition that we are made of both light and darkness, and that true wisdom lies in holding the tension between these two poles, without identifying with either one. Jung referred to this process as the alchemical wedding or coniunctio oppositorum, union of opposites. In medieval alchemy, the goal was to unite the sun, the masculine, conscious, luminous principle, and the moon, the feminine, unconscious, dark principle, to create the philosopher's stone, a symbol of wholeness and immortality, psychologically. This represents the integration of consciousness, persona, ego, with the unconscious shadow. Anima, animus. This marriage is not a single event, but a continuous process. It does not result in a state of perpetual happiness, but in an attitude of greater resilience, humility, and compassion. The person who has achieved a degree of wholeness is not immune to suffering or error. However, they are able to contain their own internal contradictions without falling apart. They can feel anger without being consumed by it. They can recognize their envy without acting maliciously. They can admit their fear without being paralyzed by it. They develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to create a third point that reconciles the conflict between opposites, leading to a new level of consciousness and a new attitude towards life. The archetypal symbol of this wholeness is the mandala. In Sanskrit, mandala means circle, and in many cultures, the circle represents wholeness, the self, God. Mandalas often contain a quaternary structure, a division into four, which symbolizes the union of the four opposites: thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, or, on another level, good and evil, masculine and feminine. The journey of integrating the shadow is ultimately a spiritual journey. It is the path to finding the divine not in a distant heaven, but in the paradoxical depth of the human soul itself. It is understanding that the image of God would not be complete without the darkness, just as the day would not be complete without the night. By embracing our shadow, we are not surrendering to evil. We are, in fact, participating in the sacred work of making consciousness more complete, of healing the split in our own nature, and in doing so, contributing to healing the split in the world. It is the hero's journey, not to slay the dragon, but to reconcile with it and thus claim the kingdom of oneself.